This is question number 35 from the August 2017 Algebra 2 exam. So in this one question, we have to sketch at least one cycle of a sine curve with an amplitude of 2. So first off, generally a sine curve starts at 0, 0 and would kind of look like this. That would be an example of one cycle, meaning until it repeats itself. So if we're looking for an amplitude of 2, that means the distance from the midline to either the maximum or the minimum has a value of 2. So from max to min, there's a total distance of 4 in this case. Normally, sine of x just would have an amplitude of 1. Now we do know the midline is at y equals -3/2. Normally, sine of x just has a midline at y equals 0. You can see that in this example here. So if the midline is at -3/2, we're basically translating this downwards, and a period of 2 pi. And that's normal for sine of x, the period being the x distance from, or how long it takes to repeat itself, or the length of one cycle. So in the graph below, you can see I've already labeled the axes, and I've done it specifically noting that there's half points between each integer. And I did that because we know our midline is at -3/2, or in other words, -1.5. And that's actually going to be our starting point. Normally, sine of x has a starting point here at 0, 0, but for us, it's going to be at 0, -1.5. So let's go ahead and zoom in and start with that point there. Oops, wrong spot. There we go. Now moving to the right, so that x has a value of pi over 2, we're going to be moving up to the maximum value, which is going to be at 0.5. And that's because we know our amplitude is 2. -1.5 plus 2 gets us up to 0.5. From here, it's going to start heading back down. So at where x is equal to pi, it's going to go back to our midline of -1.5. And then from there, it's going to keep going down. So where we get to an x value of 3 pi over 2, we'll be at our minimum, which will be 2 less than -1.5. That would be -3.5. And again, we know this because of our amplitude being a distance of 2. And then wrapping up, it's going to go at where x equals 2 pi. It's going to finish off where it started, back at the midline of -1.5. Okay, so now we've got part A complete. For the second part, it says to explain any differences between a sketch of y equals 2 sine of x minus pi over 3, all minus 3 over 2, and the sketch that we've just done. Well, we can see that our a value here being 2, that actually represents the amplitude, so that makes sense that that would not be different compared to what we drew. We can see that this subtraction of 3 over 2 represents our y-intercept. So we can see graphically that is not different from what we drew. The only difference is that it's not sine of x. In the middle here, it's sine of x minus pi over 3. What that means is that the sketch would actually be shifted pi over 3 units to the right. Just so you know, if it had been x plus pi over 3, in that situation, it would be a shift pi over 3 units to the left. But anyway, for this problem, you can see I wrote down that the new sketch would be the same as before, but it's been translated pi over 3 units to the right. And that's because, again, of it not being sine of 2 sine of x, it's 2 sine of x minus pi over 3. All right, hope that made sense, and that's all for this video. Thanks for visiting JD's Regents Preparation.